Today I'm going to go through a engine swap that I did recently. It was for a 2009 Kia Spectra. So a while back I did a compression test for a friend whose car was burning oil and smoking, and the test came out as the engine had bad piston rings, so it needed to be rebuilt or replaced. So a while later they decided to replace the engine with a used one from Pull and Save. So I got to go to Pull and Save, which I'd always wanted to go. The scary part being they didn't let any batteries into the wrecking yard, so I wasn't able to get any mileage or any compression test or anything. So we just had to go by how the car looked, how the engine looked. And one thing to do when you're looking at that is how was the car damaged? If the car doesn't look very damaged, it could have been totaled for a mechanical failure. But that car was in a pretty bad wreck. The engine was still okay, but the engine was running when it had the wreck, so most likely. So that's why we got that engine. The head looked nice and shiny, so by all appearances, it looked like it was going to be a good engine. So for engine compatibility on a 2009 Kia Spectra, the engines are compatible all the way from 2004 to 2009. If you get a 2004, however, you need to be careful. Half of the year they made one engine and half of the year they made another. So you need to make sure it's the 2.0 liter engine rather than the 1.8 liter, which is the earlier version. The vehicle I'm swapping this engine into, the 8th digit of the VIN is 2, which means it's a California emissions vehicle. Pull and Save had no California emissions vehicles in their yard. So we pulled an engine from a federal emissions vehicle. The engines looked identical, and after swapping, it ran just fine, with no problems with the engine computer or anything not accepting the new engine. On some vehicles, you would need to replace the whole engine wiring harness and the ECU, but on this vehicle, you can swap the engines between a California and a federal emissions engine with no problem. They may even be completely identical. So there's two connectors. I disconnected all the wiring. There's a connector for the oxygen sensor that was here, and then these two sensors were disconnected. There's a bunch of connectors down there, a few here, and the connector for the VVT and the ignition, and I think a few connectors down there. Got all of these disconnected. These two wires go somewhere. There's wires back here. Those wires including the evap solenoid and the throttle position sensor and a few others. And then there's a few down there. We also disconnected the fuel wiring and the fuel hose where it connects at the end there. The fuel line connects there with 2 bolts, but there's also a quick disconnect lower down on the hose. I took the power steering pump to the side, took the belts off, removed the AC, which was simply 4 12mm bolts. Took it to the side. Don't want to have to disconnect those wires because that will drain our AC and it will need a new AC recharge. Drained the coolant, disconnected coolant hoses, disconnected the vacuum hose there. 2 coolant hoses on this side of the engine. There are 2 there that go up to the manifold, and we don't need those disconnected. And there's this here that I disconnected that hose from, and the wire that plugs into that. Disconnected the cables that plug in there. One from that box, and then the other that goes into the firewall. I removed the starter, which There were two wires connected to the starter. One was held on with a nut, and then these two bolts removed the starter. Right now I'm removing the torque converter bolts. To take those off, I needed to take this piece of plastic out of the way that was in the hole where the starter was. And now I'm going to continue removing those torque converter bolts, and then I will disconnect the exhaust, and then all that will be left are all the bolts that go around connecting the engine to the transmission. And then the last thing I removed was the motor mount on the left side of the engine, which first I was going to just remove the bolt, but later I realized I needed to just remove the whole thing. And while I was lifting up the engine, I found out that I needed to remove the hood. So here we can see a little more of what it took to get out. The 4 torque converter bolts went in here, but you had to turn the engine so that it would line up with the starter hole. And then all the bolts around where it connects the engine to the transmission, some went in from this side, some went in from that side, and the one that was hardest to find was behind the motor mount. So then putting it back in was basically just a reverse order of taking it out. Just putting everything from the old engine to the new engine that the new engine didn't have, so that it was in the same configuration, and then putting it back in reverse order of taking it out. I was very happy when the engine seemed to start up and run pretty well. It took a while to start because the fuel line was disconnected and it needed to pump the fuel into the engine, which took a little while. So after putting the exhaust back together and a few other things, we took the car for a test drive. It ran well, and so far so good, and my first engine swap went pretty good. Thanks for watching.